The topic that we'll be presenting today is cyber attacks and the ethics that go behind blaming the hacker and not the victim. Although there has been a massive increase in the number of cyber attacks lately, many individuals and larger organizations are negligent in protecting their networks. So that begs the question of who is at fault when a cyber attack occurs, whether it be the victim for leaving their network unprotected or their hacker alone who's committing the crime. Our thesis is that it is not morally just to blame the victim of a cyber attack for not anticipating the attack, and therefore, punishment should only be dealt to the perpetrators of the attack. We have a video about existentialism here to explain the philosophy.
But Sartre faced meaninglessness head-on and explored one of the most agonizing aspects of existentialism. Not the world's lack of meaning, but its terrifying abundance of freedom. To most of us, freedom sounds pretty great, but Sartre thought that we are painfully, shockingly free. After all, there are no guidelines for our actions, then each of us is forced to design our own moral code, to invent a morality to live by. Sartre took this to mean that we are condemned to be free, a fate that he found to be quite awful. You might think that there's some authority you could look to for answers, Sartre said, but all of the authorities you can think of are fake. You can do what your parents say, or your church, or your government, but Sartre said those authorities are really just people like you, people who don't have any answers, people who had to figure out for themselves how to live. So the best thing you can really do, he determined, is to live authentically. Sartre used this to mean that you have to accept the full weight of your freedom in light of the absurd. You have to recognize that any meaning your life has is given to it by you. And if you decide to just phone it in and follow a path that someone else has set, whether it's your teachers, your government, or your religion, then you have what he called bad faith, a refusal to accept the absurd. If you live by bad faith, you're burying your head in the sand and pretending that something out there has meaning that you didn't give it. Which brings us to this week's Flash Philosophy. Let's go to the thought bubble.
We use this existentialist theory to explain why it is the hacker alone who is at fault for a few different reasons. For one, the hacker alone is the one making a conscious decision to commit the cyber attack, not the victim who chooses to be attacked, regardless of whether or not they have network protection or the degree of it that they have. Secondly, the hacker is responsible for knowing that this behavior is unethical and oftentimes illegal due to societal laws and constructs that we'll go over in the next slide, while victims are never committing a crime by leaving their networks unprotected. The victims are never the ones who are doing something illegal. Thirdly, the hacker is always acting according to their own free will, and this is what relates most to existentialism, because they are making that choice regardless of whoever or whatever may be putting pressure on them to commit the crime. Existentialism's emphasis on free will proves that the hacker's choice to act on unethical motives solely drives the attack, regardless of whether or not the victim chooses to protect their networks.
But Sartre faced meaninglessness.
So the first argument that we have to defend our stance is that the hacker acts according to his own free will, as existentialism most primarily emphasizes. So the primary existentialist scholar is Jean-Paul Sartre, and he said in his literature about existentialism, we mean that man first of all exists, encounters himself, surges up in the world, and defines himself afterwards. Thus, the first effect of existentialism is that it puts every man in possession of himself as he is and places the entire responsibility for his existence squarely upon his own shoulders. So, really, the most important part of this quote is that last sentence where Jean-Paul Sartre says that man is in possession of himself, which means that he's completely responsible of his own actions. So he's making the conscious decision, referring to the hacker, to commit the cyber crime according to his own free will. And it's not really having anything to do with the victim, because the hacker is the only one who's responsible for his own actions according to his free will. So that is why the hacker is the only one to blame. Furthermore, it can be safely assumed that the hacker knows that his behavior is wrong just based on the various laws that govern society in place to protect victims of cyber abuse. One of these laws, for just an example, is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And in this case, the defendant would be charged if the defendant was not authorized to access the protected computer or network under any circumstance, or just didn't have the authorization to enter the network that they entered, therefore trespassing and most likely doing so for malicious reasons. So because we all have a responsibility to know the laws that govern society, the hacker should know that their behavior is illegal and at the very least unethical, but still they knowingly choose to commit the crime. It is not the victim that invites them to commit the crime, regardless of how protected or unprotected their network is. And for that reason, the hacker has no excuse and they commit the crime knowing that it is wrong.
So our third argument is that the hacker cannot excuse their actions based on exterior pressure. So they can't say it was because of their boss, because as explained before, everyone make their own choices and it's their free will to do as they like. The individual performing manipulation to exploit the vulnerable choose to make the decision on their own. Added pressure from authority or the need to maintain a job may influence their choice, but their decision is still down to them. And they know that it's unethical. The companies rely on their employee defiance or of any morals compass as well as their blind following instructions. Satch's philosophical views reflect why the blame should belong to those subordinate workers, because he maintains that they have the freedom to defy their superiors, but instead they choose to actively hurt others who are vulnerable. So to conclude, and ways to prevent cyber attacks. Although some factors may support the likelihood of a cyber attack occurring, the others who must bear the final responsibility are those who carry out the attack. They are often aware of the situation and decide to take advantage of vulnerable users and computers, and therefore they should be held accountable for their own actions. Instead of blaming the victims, IT workers should educate themselves about the dangers while holding cyber criminals accountable. This will diminish the issue's impact as a whole and help make the web a safer place for all. As for questions now, what measures would you take in protecting yourself from a cyber attack? Second, do you think that the victim of a cyber attack should carry some blame if they did not take any necessary precautions in protecting their network, or should the hacker carry all the blame? Explain why. And our third and final question is, say you're tasked with creating a law that would punish these hackers that carry out this act. List a few points that you would include in this law.
And these are just some of our references. Thank you guys so much for listening.